How to use a floating field. It's quite normal to tag either a text object or a material on surface with a primary field. So here's a text object, it's a primary field, and there's the field number. And the same for a rectangle. I'll put on the front surface, and I've overridden the material and I've added a primary field yet again. When external software looks at the fields on a page, it sees, if we look at the field marker manager, here's page 1, there's field 1, which is the text information, and there's field 2, which is the image. So that's how external software sees fields. Template pages also have the capability to have something called a floating field on them. Now these fields don't have to be tied to any text object or a material on a surface or even a media item. They're part of the code that makes up the page. To add one of these floating fields, we go to the scene, we go to the properties, and then down here you'll see there is a floating fields. If I open this up, it gives me the ability to click here and add a floating field. I hit the little plus here, and there's my floating field, and that ID is 3 because it's automatically added the next ID on. The data from a floating field can be used as a source for a plugin. It can also be used as a data source for custom JavaScript, and like primary fields, it can also be cloned by secondary fields. If this was my floating field and had some data in my text object, if I made that a secondary field and set that to 3, then it would take the data from the floating field. Floating fields are faster. When data is sent to a text object, the text object is updated immediately the page is used. If a JavaScript or plugin needs to use the data from the text object, it then takes one frame in time before the data can be used, because it must wait until the end of the duration of that first frame being rendered before the data is available. When data is sent to a floating field, the data is immediately available because no rendering is involved, because the data is stored as part of the page. Floating fields can also handle some types of data better. To set the styles of flat 3D text objects, the data can be prefixed with a style code. So for example, I can send a square bracket at the beginning of the text data, and that will tell the text object to use a style. So here's my style palette. I've got a style A here, and with the text object, if I come down here and I go square bracket SA, close square bracket, hello, if I hit OK, you can see it's used the white style up here. Now this becomes a problem if the template is to be updated using JSON data, as JSON data often uses square brackets within the list of data, and what will happen is the flat 3D text will try and interpret these square brackets as a style. So here is some JSON data which we might want to use as a source of data to be used within the page. You can see it's a curly bracket, fruit, square bracket, apple, comma, pear, comma, orange. Then it closes the square bracket and puts a curly bracket at the end. Now I'm going to put this data into the field just as a string, so I'm just going to take out the line return. So here it is, just a straight string. I'm going to drop this string into both a flat 3D text object and a floating field. Here's my text object, that's field 1, and my floating field is field 3. I've written a little script here to see what's happening with the data. So I've just set a variable and I'm sending the data from field 1 to that variable. So F1 means field 1, which is my text object. So there is field 1, and field 3, which is my floating field, I've called F3. Now I've just logged this data so I can see what's happening. And I've put exactly the same data into the flat 3D text and to the floating field data. You can see the text has only used the data excluding the square brackets, and you can see that on screen because it's curly bracket, fruit, colon, end of curly bracket, it's ignored everything in the square bracket because it tried to treat it as if it was a style. But if I'm looking down here at my floating field data, I can see that the full JSON data is all available to be used within the JavaScript. That's just two reasons why you might want to use a floating field instead of a field attached to an object.